All right, I'm going to ask you to bear with me. I'm still not quite recovered, so my voice sounds a little bit like The Godfather today. So if I'm kind of grumbling, if you need me to repeat anything, obviously just raise your hand. We're going to pick up where we left off last time. And last time we were talking about, we're wrapping up the Uruk period. We're talking about Uruk expansion, and we have seen again the emergence of cities, city-states, and now we're looking at what Guillermo Algazi has called an informal empire. And I talked about those three different types of sites last time, and I just put a slide together again so you guys have the definitions. Algazi breaks down this informal empire, this network of sites that bring all of these goods and resources, particularly luxury goods, back to the Sumerian heartland, back to the city of Uruk. And so he breaks them down into these three different types. Enclaves, which are these large permanent settlements located at the junctions of rivers and overland routes. Often they're fortified and consist almost entirely of Uruk culture, right? Not just one or two things from Uruk, right? Not just Uruk style, say, bevel rim bowls. We're also talking about architecture. We're talking about practices, burial practices that we witness in Uruk. Really a whole package of attributes that are very similar, right? Uruk culture. The second is stations, these smaller sites that are regularly spaced along rivers and trade routes, and they facilitate trade from these enclaves to Uruk itself. So for example, on the Euphrates, you can actually find there are regularly spaced sites, 9 of them, in which individuals going back and forth to enclaves like Habuba Kabira, which we'll look at in a second, and Uruk would use as they made their way to the north and to the south. Actually, I mean, you'd be going overland to the north and then taking the river back down to the south, because obviously they only flow in one direction. The final one that Algazi outlines are outposts, and these are smaller sites that are typically located out in the periphery, sites up in the mountains that display signs of Uruk presence and influence, but at the same time maintain local material culture and traditions as well. This is a very kind of strict sort of breakdown of sites. And these sites don't necessarily fit into these categories. We looked at Susa last time, and Susa, certainly is not an enclave. We talked about how in the Susa I period it had its own very distinct culture. For example, these Susa I beakers, and then during the Susa II period, contemporary with Uruk, Susa does adopt a number of Uruk-like traits, writing, boule, seal impressions, but it does so in a very Susa-like way, right? It appropriates iconography, it appropriates practice, but it does it in its own sort of style. And by the Susa III period, it's gone all the way back to its roots, using its own writing system, Proto-Elamite, and its own, art and iconography, this lioness being a great example. We looked at that one last time. So today we're going to be wrapping up the Uruk period, and we're going to be looking at a few other sites and trying to get a sense of how this Uruk trade network worked. Probably it was a combination of force, ideology, asymmetrical trade, and we're going to look to the north. So we've already now looked to the east at Susa. Today we're going to look at 3 major sites in the north, and those 3 sites, I put them up on the board, are Habuba Kabira, Jebel Aruda, and Tel Brak. And all 3 show very different types of contact and influence with Uruk. Habuba Kabira being the first one we'll start with. We looked at it briefly last time. This is one of Algazi's enclaves, right? This is a colony, if you will, far up to the north. You can see, again, on the Euphrates, right here. And like Algazi says, situated on an east-west land trade route and also situated on the river, so perfectly located to facilitate trade with Uruk. We can see it's a 3-walled city with the Euphrates along the eastern side, so very well fortified, huge site, very big. This is actually almost a kilometer in length, but occupied only for a very short period of time, only about 100 to 150 years. It's a single period occupation site, again, meaning that this site was built specifically for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is as a trade enclave. It dates to the Uruk IV. It's contemporary with the Iana precinct. And you can see here, the architecture is very regular. Being a one-period site, it's laid out on a series of north-south and east-west streets. This is one of the first examples of what's called orthogonal city planning, regular city planning with north, south, and east-west running streets, all with a specific purpose in mind. You can see there's a very large defensive wall that runs around it. We don't have it in the south, but it did exist, and you can see in this reconstruction, which implies, this real or at least a perceived fear of attack, the need to defend the goods and things that are actually being kept here. We said last time, so what is being traded? All these wonderful precious items, lapis lazuli, carnelian, all this stuff's coming to Uruk. What are they giving back? Yeah. Grain, right, through perhaps bevel rim bowls. Another thing I didn't mention, textiles. Textiles are also being traded, and that's something that we see in later texts. Fortunately, we don't have a lot of archaeological evidence because those textiles don't exist, but another trade item that would be shipped back. But still, the system of asymmetrical exchange which is taking place from the center to the periphery, as Al-Ghazi would put it. It's interesting, this town, it doesn't seem to be making its own food. The finds from within it, we find a lot of domestic architecture. You can see here this sort of courtyard-style house, a variation on the tripartite-style structures that we've seen before. No agricultural implements at all. It seems as though this site is completely dependent on having its food imported, either by Uruk or by the surrounding countryside. The buildings are actually made, you can see them here, out of these very typical Uruk. We talked about those Rimshin bricks, the ones in the Iana complex, the ones that are standardized. They're square in their section. If you cut them in half, you'd have a perfect square. And just like the Iana complex, when you start building with these standardized bricks, now you can plan much better. So a city like this, which was planned from the very start, now you can measure things out. You say, okay, our walls here are going to be, 8 bricks thick, 10 bricks thick. In the case of these defensive walls, 3 meters thick. When you're building on such a large plan, it helps to have standardization. So that's what's taking place. These bricks are made out of molds. We should also say when we make mud brick too, that it's not just mud, right? You have to actually mix things with the mud to get it to, be a stable, solid brick. So in addition to having resources like clay and mud from rivers, you have to be able to control a huge swath of area because you're chopping up grasses and straw into chaff and mixing it with your clay to make sure you have a really nice solid mud brick. So there are studies we'll look at when we get to some of this later monumental architecture that for the construction of a ziggurat, you would need 16 square kilometers of grain or chaff to just go into that ziggurat. So, just by way of the materials alone, we can infer quite a bit in terms of what's taking place here. Next site we'll look at is similar to Habuba Kabira. It's also on the Euphrates, very, very nearby. It's called Jebel Aruda. And this site's very interesting. It's built in a really very inaccessible location. It's about 60 meters off the floodplain. And like Habuba Kabira, it's right on the water. But what's interesting is it's not at the highest point of the outcropping of rock that it's built on. It's actually built on a purposely level plain that allowed the city to sort of nestle in against the hillside to protect it from winds, and then also, of course, to protect it from attack. So we're seeing again another site that has fortification in mind. This one, again, the site's not fully excavated, but it appears to have been an administrative center or perhaps a religious center. It's not residential. We don't find a lot of residential architecture there. And just like Habuba Kabira, the inhabitants of this site didn't support themselves. They were dependent on external agriculture to keep them going. It also has a very short occupational period, only about 100 years, with 3 building phases in it. But already, right off the bat, you're seeing that this is very clearly an Uruk site. Large temple complex, right? Very similar to what we've seen at Uruk at this time. A raised platform with 2 temples built on it. And again, right, our niched mud brick facade, our tripartite layout. These 2 temples look like they could have come from, right, anywhere. They look like they could have come from Eridu. They could have come from Uruk itself. Very, very specific. This emphasis on elevation, too, as we've seen. I wanted to show just a few of the other things. These are from some of the items found at Habuba Kabira, right? Again, writing, administrative documents, cylinder seals, Uruk-type material culture being from there. And with Jebel Aruda, we can see that now as we get closer and enter into the Jemet Nasser period, that Uruk III period, the very end of Uruk culture, in addition to all of the other traits of the temple that we've talked about, now there's a new one, and that is elevation. We saw that with the Uruk White Temple. That's the Anu precinct. We see it at Tel Uqair, and then also at Jebel Aruda as well. So clearly, this site is perhaps a religious or administrative center, and given its proximity to Habuba Kabira, the 2 would have probably operated in tandem in some capacity. The third site we'll look at in terms of these northern Mesopotamian sites is Tel Brak. Tel Brak is a very different situation. For one, it's located not necessarily on the Euphrates, but a tributary of it. Actually, this is the Harbor River, which drains into the Euphrates. And Brak, you can see, is actually in a strategic location as far as these east-west trade routes go. It's located where it can take advantage both of the Euphrates, but also if you travel to the east, you can get to the Tigris without really any trouble. And Brak is a very different situation. Unlike these other 2 sites that were founded during the Uruk period for Uruk purposes, this one had a local population during the Ubaid period. It establishes ties with Uruk, very similar to Susa. During the Uruk period, we see Brak taking on a number of these Uruk-style traits, but very much like Susa, blending it to a combination of local and Uruk style traits. Sorry. The city itself is located in this very fertile plain between these 2 rivers, and it's about 43 hectares in size, so very, very large site, and perfectly located again to take advantage of these trade routes. It's about 45 meters off the plain, and at Tel Brak, we see some really interesting developments. This is the temple from the Tel. It's known as the Eye Temple for reasons we'll see in a second. But already you can see we have variations on that niched facade again, very similar again to all of our Uruk temples. And what looks like a variation on almost the T-shaped cella. If you guys remember in Temple D, right in the Uruk 4A layer in the Iyana complex, we have this T-shaped cella, the introduction of the T-shaped cella. Temple C, also in Temple D, D and C. In C, we have the tripartite temple stuck on the end of it. But this is very much in keeping with what we would expect. The